Hi, everyone. I'm doing this recording for the benefit of those of you who maybe weren't in class during our last presentation of the language development stuff, or for some of my sections that ran a little bit short on time. So the slides for this have been posted in Canvas, and I'm hoping maybe this narration will help you understand maybe either some of the things we didn't get to, or just give you another view of things that we did get to in case you do get this in class from me. So in class, we had been talking about the structures and development of language. So we talked about the difference between phonemes and morphemes, the difference between semantics and syntax where it concerns grammatical rules, and how that helps us derive meaning from the language that we're presented with. To this point, people may be questioning, well, why does that matter? The understanding that children acquire language in the way that they do had spurred interest by a lot of linguists and cognitive scientists regarding how is it exactly that children are so adept at picking up language so quickly? Because we do have this critical period for language development where we learn language seemingly without effort and at the response of simple exposure to it over time. Just being exposed to your parent language produces a lot of growth in children's language skills at a very early age. And of course, once we pass that critical period, it becomes difficult. But researchers like Noam Chomsky actually felt that children's capacity to learn language is so impressive that it couldn't be explained just based on exposure alone. So he actually is making an argument for a little bit of nature. If you think back to that nature-nurture argument, within children's language abilities, that perhaps children come into the world with an inborn or innate ability to pick up the structures of language, and he called this theory universal grammar. And the evidence that he would cite in support of this theory is the idea that children, as they start to internalize the rules for grammar within a language, often make mistakes that show they understand the rule. But those mistakes wouldn't have been things that they had actually been exposed to because they never would have heard an adult say it. So, for example, a child might say, mommy goed to the store. When you hear a child say that, they're actually applying a rule for semantics in English, the idea that you'd add ed to the end of a verb to make it past tense. That means they understand the rule. They're just overgeneralizing it. They're applying it in a context in which they've never heard it. And because they've never heard it before, this is a self-generated act. It's actually coming from something internal to them, or at least an internalized understanding of the rules for grammar within that language. So if you want to click on this link, you certainly are welcome to. This link actually takes you to a video that I took of my niece, and by accident I actually caught one of these overgeneralizations from her. We were sledding, and she told my husband, "Oh, you're going to get crashed," which suggested she understood something about how grammar works, even though she never would have heard her aunt or uncle, or her mom or dad for that matter, use that kind of language. She never would have been presented with that. So perhaps Chomsky's arguing that maybe some of our ability to learn language comes from within and might be due to wiring of the brain. And there is some support from the neuroscience on this as well. Researchers have identified, mostly from case study patients who have had damage to these areas due to stroke or injury, the idea that there are certain brain structures that are very much involved in, or have specialized roles in processing speech. So Broca's area up here in the frontal lobe seems to be very involved in productive speech. It coordinates the muscle movements involved in speaking. And when it's damaged, the people have fluency errors. They can't produce fluent speech. Wernicke's area over here is involved in comprehending or understanding language that is presented to you. So it's a receptive language use area. We generally refer to any kind of language impairment due to brain damage or stroke as aphasia. So Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia are just specific types of that. But this actually lends some credence to Chomsky's idea that maybe there's something internal and even biologically based about our ability to learn language. But of course, his theory is not the only one that has been used to explain some aspects of language development. Folks who are supportive of statistical learning as an explanation for language use tend to argue that maybe it is just exposure over time that helps us understand grammar and understand the rules of language, in part because we are so exposed to the language in which, our parent language, that we start to determine, even at an unconscious level, statistical patterns in language use. So, for example, as you're hearing me speak in this video, I'm actually speaking kind of quickly. I'm not actually pausing between the words that I use. So if you are not a native English speaker, my voice might sound like one continuous stream of sound. In fact, if you've ever heard or tried to learn a foreign language and had to listen to audio recordings, you might have had that frustrating experience where the speaker seems to be just like running in one continuous stream of sound. But because you are a native English speaker, you actually know darn well where one word begins and another ends, not because I'm leaving space between them, but because you're actually anticipating before the sentence is even finished what words I'm likely to say. And one example of that that is often used to illustrate statistical learning, I'm going to present to you right now. It might be helpful to pause the video right after I take this off the screen, because I want you to just read that sentence and then see if you can write it down. Most people, when I ask them to write this down, actually make an error. And it's a predictable one. Most people read this as flowers bloom in the spring, because that's a pattern that they're used to, and they fail when you ask them to write it down to include the double the, because we don't repeat those articles in typical sentences in English. So your brain is actually already kind of zipping along, doing a lot of the anticipation and analysis of word structures without you having to consciously attend to it, and statistical learning theorists tend to think that that experience is gained over time due to nurture types of things. Now, probably the most controversial and also most interesting theory about how language and thinking overlap is Benjamin Lee Whorf's hypothesis that we sometimes refer to as linguistic determinism. Now, this sounds very fancy, but all it means literally is that language may determine how we think. So our ability to understand certain concepts may actually be enhanced or limited by the words that our language has for those things. There's kind of softer versions of this. One is called linguistic relativity, just that our understanding of certain concepts may be relative to the language that we're using. So a Spanish speaker might think about a concept in a different way than an English speaker would, because Spanish has different words or verb constructions that are used to explain that same concept. To give you some practical examples, I do hope you'll pause the video and click on the slides and go to 3 minutes and 20 seconds on the video that I have linked up here, because it actually gives you an example of researchers who have explored whether or not having words for certain colors limits your ability to see and discriminate between those colors. It'll actually show you a researcher who's doing some work with the Himba tribe who don't have words that distinguish between green and blue, and that actually makes it a really challenging task for them when presented with green and blue colors to be able to pick out which one is which. So the short version of this is that language influences our thought, and if you use a different language, you might end up having a different type of thinking pattern. If your language doesn't even have a word for something, that might limit your ability to think about it, and the more words that your language has for the idea or concept might confer upon you an ability to think about it in a more complex way. Other examples that are frequently cited in reference to this theory include, okay, if we use the pronoun he in kind of a universal way, talking about, for example, man's unique potential. When people use that phrase, they tend to use the word man to mean all humans, but when you ask people to visualize or report what they're thinking when you say that, they actually do literally think of a man and not a female, or not all humans. It's also been used to explain that perhaps folks who are bilingual may have an advantage in their thinking because they have more words, concepts, and ideas to explain different things, and it might add some mental flexibility for them. Of course, the big counter or challenge to Whorf's linguistic determinism hypothesis, or the idea of linguistic relativity, is that there are certainly lots of examples of where people can think without language. So visual rehearsals of things where athletes or musicians maybe visualize a performance before it happens, and that actually aids their performance abilities later on. Those things don't necessarily involve words. If I asked you to visualize how many windows are in your living room, you probably would just visualize that, and that doesn't necessarily involve words. So our thinking isn't completely tied to words and language, but most folks in the cognitive science think that language at least has an influence, even if it's a subtle one, on our ability to think. So I hope that summary, even though it was quick, helps you make better sense of the stuff from Module 36, and particularly some of the things that we might not have had time to address in class. I'll be available to answer questions, of course, during prime time and during our study sessions, so I hope your preparations for this unit's test go very well.